Hi, my name is Jenny Lauren Dowden for Conduit News, and today we have Jay Greene joining us again. Many of you know he's a senior research fellow with the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me on again.
Oh my goodness, we love having you here at Conduit.
I love being here.
It's so fun. The work that you all are doing at Heritage right now, specifically there in education, it is so good. And you guys are coming out with some really great studies that are so relevant.
Good. I'm glad they're useful.
Okay, today I want to talk to you about how we can curb wokeism in the education system. So you and a fellow coworker, colleague, recently released a study explaining this and making the comparison and bringing in school choice and how that plays a factor. Right. Talk to us about this.
Sure. So we were interested in the relationship between empowering parents to choose schools and how woke those schools tend to be. So what we did is we first measured how empowered parents were to have choices. So we looked at charter schools across 30-some states, and we looked at how regulated those charter schools were. We used the Center for Education Reform's measure of regulation. And so the more regulated charter schools are, the less that parents are in charge, and the more that regulators are in charge, the more that authorizers control what schools are open as opposed to parents. So we use that as our measure of regulation. And then we measured how woke schools are by looking at their parent-student handbooks and searching for certain key terms in those handbooks. Now, wokeism is not a very clearly defined concept, but it roughly captures a set of progressive pedagogical and ideological views that have become more common in schools. And so what we did is we looked for certain key terms that are more commonly expressed by these kinds of progressive educators, those who hold these woke preferences. So we searched for those key terms, and we counted how frequently they were mentioned in over 600 charter school parent-student handbooks across 30-some states. And what we found is that there's significant variation across states in how woke their charter schools are. In some states, the charter schools are very woke, and in other schools, they're not very woke at all, as measured by how frequently these key terms are mentioned in the student handbooks. And we also found that it's strongly related to how regulated the charter schools are. So in states with low levels of regulation, states like Arizona and Florida, we found that there was very little wokeism in the parent-student handbooks. That's because the parents are in charge, and on average, the parents have a preference for much less wokeism in their kids' school than is provided to them typically if they're not in charge. So the more in charge the parents are, the more choices they have, the less wokeism we find in schools. On the other hand, very highly regulated charter schools, even in conservative states, will have very woke charter schools. So like Alabama, which is a conservative state, we would think that its schools wouldn't be very woke, but because its charter schools are fairly highly regulated, the schools tend to be much more woke in Alabama than they are in Florida or in Arizona. And I should just mention that Arkansas is kind of in the middle, as it is on everything, right? Arkansas is always in the middle. We're in the middle of the country, so Arkansas is about in the middle in terms of how heavily regulated charter schools are, and its charter schools are not particularly woke. They're slightly below average in terms of how woke they are. But they're more woke than less conservative states. So charter schools in Wisconsin, Minnesota are actually less woke than charter schools in Arkansas, because those states are less regulated in their charter schools. So state ideology matters, and it matters because families will have different preferences about how woke they want their schools to be, and in more progressive states, they want more progressive schools.
Right.
But even in a conservative state, people may be stuck with a woke duopoly where, their only choice is between a traditional public school that's woke and a charter alternative that's also woke, because that's what regulators give them as their choice. But if they're given lots of choices, they will choose a school that's less woke on average.
Talk to us a little bit more. You briefly touched on this, how you all measured this. You mentioned the handbooks. How else did you measure wokeism in these schools?
Well, that was it. It was just,
okay. Well, because also there are so many schools, I think, that will not even put the verbiage in the policy handbook.
Right.
So how do you deal with that?
So look, all research is imperfect.
Yeah.
This is not particle physics.
Yeah. I know, but
this is but we think it's a reasonable proxy.
Yeah.
For on average what's going on in school. So it's true that some schools might be very woke in the actual classroom, but not so much in the handbook, or vice versa. But we think it's roughly accurate to use the presence of a lot of key terms. So the more they talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, restorative discipline, social emotional learning, the more they talk about these things, that is what we could think of the handbook as essentially an advertisement. And the more they're advertising these things, the more that they're prioritizing them. And then the question is, who are they advertising to? Are they advertising really to the authorizer, the regulator, or to the parents?
Right.
And the more that they're advertising to the parents, the less they emphasize those terms.
Talk to us about how states like Arkansas, or the ones that are that have higher regulations. It would have to be through policy, I would think, but to help kind of remove those barriers, those regulations with those schools. And also talk to us about, this is a conversation that you and I have had before. It is really, it's good, right, to propose legislation that, stops CRT teaching and that sort of thing. But ultimately, there's always going to be a workaround, in my opinion. I think that, for these institutions to answer to those in higher authority, not necessarily the parents, and to get around those issues. So talk to us about why something like school choice is ultimately the end goal.
Sure. So our goal here, I think, is to align the values that are taught in schools with the values that families prefer. So education is an extension of child rearing. It's just part of what we do to raise our children. And we want to make sure that families are able to raise their children in their own values. So their schools should be aligned with their values. And we've increasingly noticed that schools are out of sync with the values that families are trying to teach at home. And we could try to correct that by forbidding the schools from teaching values that are out of sync. But that's problematic in a variety of ways. One of them is that parents actually want a diversity of things, and so we don't know entirely what to ban or what to forbid. But also, we have a bigger problem in that you can't really control what happens in schools through legislation very easily, because at the end of the day, the teacher is in a classroom and closes the door and they do whatever they want. And there's very little accountability there. So the only way to have schools and their values be really accountable to parents is if the parents are in charge of it. If the parents choose it or do it themselves, then they have a lot more control over what's happening. And if they then detect that their school is out of sync with the values they're trying to teach, they can find a different school or do it themselves without having to give up all the resources that they had available for their kids. So I think this has another, important implications for homeschoolers too.
Yeah, I would love to talk to you about that as well. I think that one thing that we hear often here at Conduit, a lot of our viewers, they do homeschool, and they have been for years. This is even pre-pandemic. And they like the idea of the ESA program, but they are concerned about additional regulations. They are concerned about, okay, well, if they do expand school choice and they offer this option to us, we're hesitant to accept it because of particular strings that may be attached. Talk to us about that.
Sure. I understand exactly where they're coming from. And I think the saying is that government shekels bring government shackles, right? So if the government pays, they're going to regulate and they're going to control what homeschoolers are doing, and homeschoolers don't want that. I understand that concern. The problem with expressing that concern as a reason for opposing ESAs or other forms of school choice is the truth is that the government can regulate homeschooling without paying for it. That is, you can get government shackles without shekels, which is the worst of all worlds, right? They can, so there's no reason why they can't regulate you without providing you with resources. And there's no reason why they have to regulate you just because they do provide you with resources. And so these are really two separate dimensions and two separate fights that we need to have. One is, do we want to empower families with the resources for educating their children? And the other is, do we want to control the extent to which the government's going to regulate education?
Right.
And I think we can fight on both fronts and win on both fronts.
You do.
I do. I mean, and in fact, we know it's true, and this study helps demonstrate that it's true because we can point to lots of examples, Arizona, Florida, where government regulation is very low, and where government resources are made available to empower families to control the education of their own children. So we know that it's possible to pull off both, and we have models of it around the country where that's happened, and there's no reason why we can't do the same in Arkansas. Look, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So we're always going to have to be on the alert, for attempts to hijack our children's education. But the best way to avoid the hijacking of that education is to give families the resources to do it themselves, or to select the people who will do it for them.
So then how do we move this forward? So how would we accomplish this in Arkansas? You mentioned we have models in other states. How do we get that done here?
So I think in prior conversations about the prospects for school choice in Arkansas, I think I've expressed to you skepticism that Arkansas was really on the cusp of. But I'm actually more optimistic right now. I am. I'm hearing momentum for school choice in Arkansas. I think there's an excitement among policymakers for it. I think that I'm hearing excitement within the incoming governor's staff for the idea. So I think the fact that a key staff person for the incoming Governor Sanders came from Governor Ducey's office in Arizona is another very positive sign for school choice. So I think this year might be the year for Arkansas, and it's worth a good try. And here's the nice thing also about school choice, which is every defeat is temporary and every victory is permanent.
That's awesome.
So if you lose this time, just come back and try again next time. And I also think that there is momentum for what I think is the preferred model of school choice, which is ESAs, or education savings accounts. What that does is it takes the money that's would normally be spent, or some proportion, something like 90% of the money that would normally be spent on a child's education in a traditional public school, and it sets it aside in an account that the parents control, and that the parents can then use for any educational purpose, and not for a single provider. That is, it doesn't have to go to for a private school tuition. It can go for that, but it can also go for therapists, or for instructional materials, or educational equipment. Anything that's related to the effort to educate a child would be an appropriate use of those funds and can be directed by the parents as they see fit. So it really puts the parents in charge of educating their child with the resources that they pay taxes for, that if they just homeschool or just pay for a private school tuition, they have to do entirely out of their own pocket. Here, they can do it with the resources that they pay taxes for.
And would you say to our policymakers this coming session, go big or go home? Let's give full,
right?
Like
right.
Don't give us school choice light. Don't give us school
right.
choice in name only.
Right.
Let's, do what other states have done. This is the time.
I agree. Look, Conduit had a great piece on its website recently, a great article describing the current state of school choice in Arkansas. And it rightly says there is school choice, but it's really tiny and not very good. And so more bills to create more really tiny and not very good school choice is really just not, I think, the thing that the legislature should be doing. I think there is, again, momentum for universal ESAs. Everyone eligible, light regulation. There are models for this in other states like Arizona, West Virginia, Florida has not ESAs, but a different design. So there are models for how one could do this. Big states, and I think it's spreading. Texas is on the cusp as well. Oklahoma's on the cusp. I think Iowa and Idaho are also possibilities. So I see 5-6 states that are likely to pass universal ESAs in the next legislative session. And Arkansas could be one of them.
That's so exciting.
Well,
and what your study does and what other studies that you all have recently released, the data is there. You guys are showing time and time again that ultimately this is what parents want. This is what their constituents want. They want to have the choice and the freedom to choose the best education that serves their child best.
Right. And we think a central part of that is values alignment. That is, parents don't want their kids taught values that undermine what they're trying to teach at home. So it's not merely about proficiency in math and reading, although those are very important too. But it's also about values. And so we've done a lot of work, including in this new study, showing that school choice, expanding school choice, empowering parents, helps align the values of schools with the values of parents. And we think public policy should be helping parents raise their children, not substituting what policymakers think for what parents think.
Incredible insight. As always, really anything that you would like to mention that we did not cover?
No, I mean, I think the study got a lot of reaction. Some people don't like it, right? I should be clear. They don't like it. They don't like the term wokeism. It's a funny thing because I think woke was originally articulated by its practitioners as a positive term to describe themselves, but now when it's used to describe them critically, they say it's imaginary. It doesn't really exist. So there's kind of gaslighting that goes on. And then they also demand precise definitions. And I think, we don't have to have a precise definition to understand that there is a general worldview that consists of progressive pedagogy, and ideology. And while there isn't universal agreement among people who might be described as woke or describe themselves as woke in what those are, I think we have a general idea of what they are, and I think we've reasonably measured them with searching for key terms in student handbooks. And I think what we've demonstrated is that there are these huge differences in the priority given to this woke, these woke agendas based on how much we empower parents.
Have schools answer and be held accountable to parents, not regulators.
Right, and then they'll teach what parents want, not what regulators want.
All right, thank you so much for being with us today. Look forward to having you back on again soon.
Great, thank you very much.